What's good, YouTube? Welcome back to World Watch Live. Today, we are talking about fuel prices, why they're rising right now, what's actually causing it behind the scenes, and more importantly, where they could be headed next. Because here's the reality, this isn't just about gas getting a little more expensive. What's happening right now could impact everything from how much you pay at the pump to your groceries, flights, and even the overall economy. And the craziest part, most people have no idea how close we are to a scenario where prices could spike fast, like overnight. So in this video, I'm going to break it down in the simplest way possible. What's happening right now, why it matters to you, and the different scenarios of where fuel prices could go depending on how this situation plays out. Trust me, you're going to want to see this.
Are continuing to surge, rising by more than $1 in just the last month.
Wall Street reacting to the war in the Middle East. Stocks tumbling on Friday to close at their lowest level in over 7 months.
Gas station and most gas stations around the country right now, we're 3 cents off of a $4, price per gallon here, and that's just a penny off what we're seeing for the national average, around $3.98.
All right, so to understand why gas prices are rising right now, we need to look at what's actually happening in Iran, and more importantly, what it's doing to the global oil supply. Right now, the conflict has escalated in one of the most important regions for energy in the entire world. The Middle East produces roughly 30% of the world's oil, and a huge portion of that oil has to pass through one very specific location, the Strait of Hormuz. What you're looking at right here is the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points in the world. Every ship you see is carrying oil from countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the UAE. Nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this one location. That's why it matters. It's narrow, crowded, and there are almost no alternative routes. These arrows show where that oil goes, across the globe. And if this gets disrupted, supply drops and prices rise. Because what happens here affects the entire world. And here's where things start to get serious. That narrow stretch of water handles about 20% of all global oil shipments. But because of the war, tanker traffic through that area has slowed down dramatically. Some reports even say it's nearly come to a halt due to attacks, threats, and safety concerns. So what happens when that much oil suddenly can't move? Supply drops fast. And when supply drops, but demand stays the same or even increases, prices spike. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. Since the conflict began, oil prices have surged to around $100 per barrel or higher, with some spikes even going beyond that as the situation becomes more unstable. But it's not just about ships being delayed. There are also direct attacks on energy infrastructure, oil facilities, gas fields, and transport systems, which makes it even harder to produce and export oil in the first place. So now you have two major problems happening at the same time: less oil being produced and less oil being transported. That combination is what's driving prices up globally. And here's the key thing most people don't realize. Gas prices in the US don't just depend on US oil. Oil is priced on a global market, meaning when prices rise anywhere, especially in a region this important, it pushes prices up everywhere. That's why even though the US produces a lot of its own oil, Americans are still seeing higher prices at the pump. And we're already seeing it happen. Gas prices have jumped significantly in a short period of time, with some areas seeing sharp increases week over week as the market reacts to uncertainty. Because at the end of the day, the oil market runs on one thing: confidence. And right now, there's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty about how long the conflict lasts, uncertainty about whether the strait fully reopens, and uncertainty about how much more supply could be lost if things escalate further. And when markets don't have answers, prices go up. That's why what's happening in Iran isn't just a regional conflict. It's something that's directly impacting your wallet, whether you realize it or not. And the big question now becomes, how far could this go? Okay, so now let's get into realistic future price estimates for gas at the pump, flights, and groceries if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed and the war in Iran keeps dragging on. Right now, the reason everyone is watching Hormuz is simple. This tiny waterway handles about 1/5 of the world's oil flows and roughly a quarter of global seaborne oil trade. So, if that route stays blocked, the world is suddenly missing a huge chunk of accessible supply, and markets start pricing in fear almost immediately. Here's the price outlook. Under a prolonged war scenario, analysts polled by Reuters are looking at Brent crude averaging roughly $135 a barrel. If the damage spreads or key export infrastructure takes bigger hits, that number moves closer to $150 to $155 a barrel. And in a true worst case shock, some analysts see spikes all the way toward $175 to $200 a barrel. That doesn't mean oil stays there forever, but it shows how violent the move could get if this conflict expands and shipping through Hormuz stays heavily disrupted. So what does that mean for regular people at the pump? The US national average is already sitting near 3.98 per gallon. If Brent settles in that $135 to $155 zone for a sustained stretch, a realistic national range for regular gas is probably around 475 to 550 a gallon. And if oil really blows out toward $175 to $200, then a national average around 550 to 650 is absolutely on the table, with some states going much higher than that. That's because gas prices have already shown how fast they react. In just 1 month, the national average jumped about $1 as crude surged. Flights would be hit hard too. Jet fuel prices have already nearly doubled since the war began, and airlines are starting to pass that through. Some carriers have already raised fuel surcharges by more than 30%, and United has warned fares could rise by about 20% if oil keeps climbing. So in practical terms, if you're booking domestic travel, especially last minute, you could be looking at fares maybe 10% to 20% higher than normal. On long-haul international routes, especially Europe, Asia, and anything affected by rerouting, you could easily see tickets rise by $100 to $300 or more, depending on the airline and route. If the crisis gets worse, that number could go even higher because airlines are dealing with both expensive fuel and longer flight paths. And then there's groceries. This is where people sometimes think prices would explode overnight like gas, but groceries usually move slower. The catch is that higher oil prices raise farm fuel costs, fertilizer costs, refrigeration costs, packaging costs, and transportation costs. The Fed says oil shocks do push food prices higher, but the effect builds gradually over time rather than all at once. So if this war continues and oil stays elevated for months, grocery inflation probably doesn't look like an instant panic spike. It looks more like a steady squeeze. A fair scenario would be overall grocery bills rising another 3% to 7% over time from energy-related pressure alone, with the biggest hits showing up in products that depend heavily on transport, cold storage, or fertilizer. In a more severe oil shock, that pressure could move into the high single digits. So the big takeaway is this. If Hormuz stays shut and the Iran war keeps escalating, oil in the $135 to $155 range becomes a serious possibility. That could push U.S. gas toward $5 a gallon or higher, lift airfares by around 10% to 20%, and slowly raise grocery bills as higher energy costs spread through the economy. And if the market starts pricing a true worst-case scenario, something closer to $175 to $200 oil, then you're talking about a much more painful global shock, one that could hit drivers, travelers, and families at the checkout line all at the same time. Bottom line, this isn't just a Middle East story. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, it becomes a world economy story, and one that could hit your wallet faster than most people realize. Now here's the reality. This situation is changing fast. What we talked about today could look completely different in just days or even hours. If you have travel plans, if you drive, or honestly, if you just buy groceries, this directly affects you. So if you want real, straight to the point updates without the fluff, make sure you hit subscribe right now and share this video with anyone who needs to see it, because most people have no idea what could be coming next. This is World Watch Live. and we'll keep you ahead of the story.